Here's one more reason. Here's one more reason.
I cannot control that.
I think they're agreed.
Oh no, that's right. Well, we can. That's isn't it?
That can be our image. I don't know.
Hello, just to let you know, we are already on YouTube. So just to let you know, we didn't start the Zoom.
All right. So we'll do that. We just while Alan is leading the meditation, keep the camera on him.
Yeah, probably better. Yeah, there's maybe nothing more needs to be said.
So,
Can you run the test?
So how much time do we have before we start? No, put
1 minute to go.
Put the camera on this, and we'll start the music, and then we'll start the music now while people come in. So start. Leo, can you put the put the camera on the icon? That's it. Okay.
Come way forward. Otherwise, I'm just holding the shadow.
Some night version shortly.
Veni Sancte Spiritus, tui amores bene macella, veni Sancte Spiritus, veni Sancte Spiritus, veni Sancte Spiritus, tui amores bene macella, veni Sancte Sancte Spiritus, Veni Sancte Spiritus, Veni Sancte Spiritus, Tui amores vivem agenda, Veni Sancte Spiritus, Veni Sancte Spiritus.
Okay. Adriana, are we ready? Adriana, are we ready?
You are online.
Good. So, welcome to Bonnevaux on a beautiful spring morning, afternoon, and welcome to all of you from different parts of the world, from Brazil, Trinidad, and UK, Ireland. Messages are coming in from all over the world. So as before, we're going to dedicate this time of dialogue between our two great and sister traditions to a sense of connection between all those who are suffering, those who are anxious, those who are frightened during this corona crisis. So all of you who are here, we want you to feel connected. We feel connected with you from Bonnevaux. And we'd like us all to be able to take this sense of connection and friendship and share it with others in whatever way we can. So we keep very much in our hearts and in our prayer today, as we pursue the way of wisdom, we keep in our hearts the need for compassion as we deal with the suffering in this troubled world. And we're going to today be led by Alan, who is going to begin with a commentary on a well-known Buddhist text that he will introduce, and there'll be time for dialogue, and then he will lead the guided meditation, which will conclude our session. So welcome, Alan and Eva. It's nice to see you again. And Alan, over to you.
Thank you, Laurence. It is lovely to be having such a sense of communion, of closeness, and yet all of us keeping very safe, not contracting the virus or giving it to anyone else. So at your suggestion, Laurence, I thought we'd begin here with a brief comment by me and then turn to you and then to Eva, addressing fundamental issues in Christianity and Buddhism. And you drew my attention to the Greek term hamartia, which is translated, I think, often as sin, but means to err, to miss the target. I saw also a tragic flaw. And to relate this to the Buddhist understanding, there is a term in Tibetan, dikpa, which really translates very closely as sin. But then, and I'll try to be very concise, every type of sin, every type of misdeed, every time that we err in our pursuit of happiness and our wish to be free of suffering, it stems from ignorance, and most fundamentally, the ignorance or the unawareness, the not knowing of who we are. Not knowing what is the referent is a very simple idea, but what is the referent of the word I, or you, or Eva, or anybody else? What is it referring to? To think that it's referring to the body is a foolishness that's been exacerbated by the materialists who have supplanted God with matter and take that as the ground of being. I find it a very foolish idea, but many people find it apparently appealing. But the notion that this body is a person, then what part? The frontal cortex, is not a person. And then when I look at my mind, the thoughts, emotions, desires, and so forth, none of those are a person either. I observe my mind, I observe my body, but who is it that is observing? Who is the agent? Not knowing. And out of not knowing, then we, and this is avidya, not knowing, the referent of who am I mistake that which is not I for mine. Pause.
Okay.
That's a lot. Thank you. Sounded good. So we're back live again. Not knowing who I am then grasping onto that which I am not. I'm not a body, I'm not mind, I'm not thought, I'm not even awareness. I am aware. Who is it that is aware? But again, I'm not simply cognizant, but I care. I'm in motion. And so the erring comes out of this ignorance and this misapprehension of who I am as someone autonomous, separate, and then pursuing happiness, looking outwards, something out there that will make me happy, something out there that is root of my suffering. And then all error comes from that. All sin comes from that. And so that's a fundamental starting point. And then Laurence, I thought perhaps you could respond from a Christian perspective, and then Eva could round out this opening of our communion here.
Thank you. Yes, well, the reason there was a question that came up from a number of comments after our first dialogue a couple of days ago about this relationship between sin and ignorance and illusion. And well, very briefly, I think you touched on the core of it, which is the question of who I am, and who I am is my self-knowledge. And if my self-knowledge is flawed, as it usually is to some degree, then I will be acting erroneously and won't even know what I'm doing. And this is one of the great last sayings of Jesus from the cross. Forgive them. He didn't even say, I forgive them. He asked the Father, that means the ground of being, to forgive because they do not know what they are doing. They did not know what they were doing. And there was no clearer sin or erroneous action in history than to crucify Jesus. But out of that came a revelation of the meaning of forgiveness, that the forgiveness comes from the ground of being, not just from the individual who has been hurt, but from the ground of being itself, which is truth. And that forgiveness recognizes, and compassionately and wisely, the ignorance that lies behind the sin.
And Eva?
Yeah, perhaps I'll speak more about this on Thursday, but I find that the question of ignorance, sin across traditions is so closely related to the problem of suffering, and the question that arises so often in Judeo-Christian tradition: how can a good God allow suffering to exist? And I've often found that the Buddhist explanation offers us a new perspective on that very question without contradicting the way it's been spoken for millennia in the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is, I'll just put it this way: because of sin, because of the blindness of ignorance, which is so often used in the Christian Hesychast tradition as well, that ignorance is a blindness, the world that we perceive with its flawed causes and conditions right now is not the world that the all good divine God creates. We get glimpses of it, we have intuitions of it, but insofar as we're trapped in that blindness of ignorance, which leads us to sin, leads us to act improperly toward our fellow sentient beings and towards our environment, it's that so twists our perceptions, and in a Buddhist context, actually changes those perceptions into karmically stained appearances, that it looks like a world that couldn't have been created by a good God. Whereas the deeper we go in our own purification to remove those fundamental stains of blindness and ignorance, the more we are able to glimpse that totally pure creation that the Judeo-Christian tradition has always said is there, that God creates. And so what Alan will speak about today is almost like the fundamental presentation from the perspective of the great perfection in Buddhism of what that pure reality emerges from and looks like.
So any final comment before I launch into?
No, as they say in the desert tradition, Father, give us a word.
I will give at least one or two. This term Dzogchen, which we well translate as great perfection, is the lineage, the current of Buddhism that I've been focusing on for the past 30 years. And I do find a profound synthesis here. Buddhism starts out with a view that this whole of this samsara, the world as we experience it, is saturated by dissatisfaction, a longing that is never fulfilled, whether it's personal relationships, job, money, beauty, and so forth and so on. It tantalizes and yet never fulfills. And therefore, if we look outwards for the actual source of our happiness, we will always find it to be unsatisfying because we expected too much. And so the notion of all of samsara being permeated by suffering is really foundational to Buddhism, on the one hand. On the other hand, when we go to what I and many other Tibetan Buddhists regard as the pinnacle of Buddhist theory and practice, this great perfection, the assertion here is that there is a perspective from which one can look at the whole bandwidth of samsara, the whole phenomenal world that is accessible to us, as well as the transcendent, and see it all as good, all as equally pure, all as an effulgence, a creation, a display of divine consciousness. So it seems like there's a very great abyss between those two views. But it's not that there are different objectively existent realities out there, but rather viewing appearances as one shifts one's own perspective from an ordinary, delusional, dualistic human mind of reifying self, reifying other, cutting through that, going deeper and deeper until one breaks through to the ground of being and views reality from that perspective and sees the whole of reality as a great perfection. At that point, one can go back to Genesis and hear the statement that God looked upon creation and said, it is good. So with this preamble, then I'd like to turn to a recent text that was composed by one of my own spiritual mentors who passed away just a few years ago, and only months before he passed away, I had the great privilege of receiving his own oral commentary, transmission of this quintessential text that he composed on the view, meditation, and conduct as presented in the Dzogchen lineage of Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. His name is Yangtang Rinpoche, and I think just a couple of words about him would be very relevant here, especially as we're also vividly aware that we're living in a time of crisis, of bewilderment, of uncertainty, of fear. And Yangtang Rinpoche, I think he outdoes us all in the sense that at a relatively young age, early middle age, he was, during the Cultural Revolution in China, which had absorbed Tibet, he was imprisoned. He was imprisoned for the simple reason that he was a lama, a distinguished lama, a high lama, and that was good enough for the Chinese communist authorities to imprison him and incarcerate him for 18 years in a concentration camp. So it was borderline starvation. And during those 18 years that he was there, at the whim of the director of the prison, he could be taken out and shot. You never know, from day to day. What will be the whim of the director of the prison? What will be the whim of the policymakers about what do you do with incarcerated lamas? You could die at any time. They could just take you out and shoot you, and they don't need to explain it to anyone. They were a law unto themselves, and of course he was faultless. I think that pretty well tops all of our experience facing this virus. 18 years, concentration camp, abject poverty, and knowing that you could be shot any day for no reason at all that you can fathom. He took that situation in which he was plunged and he transformed it into an 18-year meditative retreat. And he devoted himself single-pointedly, day and night, to the view, the meditation, the way of life of the great perfection. And he said in conclusion, I was happier in prison than most people are outside. So we know many cases like this, but this is one that comes into my sphere of experience. I received teachings from him on multiple occasions, and the last time at his home in Sikkim, I had the privilege of serving as his interpreter. So I think his words in writing, his commentary have great gravitas, rather like Viktor Frankl writing about man's search for meaning. Coming from Auschwitz, his words have a special weight. So do those of Yangchen Rinpoche. So with this lovely introduction that you suggested we partake of, Laurence, then we turn to an excerpt from his text. And it is a foundational excerpt. It's not simply sections that I like. In his presentation of the view, meditation, and conduct, he begins, of course, with view. And he writes here, if you wish to look into the mirror of the actual nature of your mind, do not look outward, rather look inward. Looking outward involves the delusion of reification. By looking inward, you observe your own mind. So again, bringing this into the present moment, I think many of, or not, if not all of us, are captivated, fixated on the daily headlines about the spread of the virus, how people are coping, not coping, what's the prognosis, how is this going to turn out? We're looking outwards, and this theme of reification, the delusion of reification, means as we look outwards, there's a very natural tendency to look out and see and have the impression or the view that everything we're observing, experiencing, knowing is absolutely out there, independent of whatever we think about it, independent of our perceptions, inherently, objectively real, and it's just dished up to us. But this reification of the outer is rooted in the reification of the inner in the same way. I, not knowing who I am, then reifying myself as a subject. I am over here. I, Alan Wallace, I'm autonomous. I'm in here. And there's somehow a very real demarcation between I and you, self and other, subject and object. And that is the root, ignorance and delusion. In the Buddhist view, it is the root of all of our craving, our grasping outside, and all of our aversion and hostility directed to the other as being the source of our problems. So he says, pause. Clearly, there's a time to look outwards. Clearly. But first, look inwards to try to eradicate this delusion, the misapprehension of I am, which is bound to give rise to a misapprehension of who you are and the surrounding world. To see subject and object, self and other, as constantly arising from moment to moment in mutual interdependence. That I'm seeing you through my lens, you're seeing me through your lens. It's always from a perspective and seeing the interdependence of self and other. And so he says, look inwards. In this theme of knowing thyself, look inwards not upon your brain or your body, but observe your own mind. This is in contrast to our general tendency, and that is whatever thought comes up, we're thinking it. An emotion comes up, we're in the grip of the emotion. A desire comes up, we're focusing on the referent of the desire. Whatever comes up in the mind, involuntarily and often unconsciously, we identify with it fully, that we collapse our very sense of identity down to I am thinking, I am feeling, I want, I fear. But desires, feelings, emotions, thoughts are not a person. I have a sense that they are mine because I identify with them. I have a sense that this body is mine because I identify with it, but I look upon your body, I don't identify with it, and therefore I have the sense of being other. But does this body really have an owner? Do these thoughts really have an independent thinker? The emotions having an independent feeler behind them? Is there really someone in here, autonomous, independent, existing from my own side? Look within, and you may be able to crack this hard nut of reification. So he goes right into a practice, which is foundational. And I've been practicing now for 30 years and have found immensely rich, and yet it is so simple. He writes here, do not follow after past thoughts or anticipate thoughts to come. So thoughts that have gone by, don't linger, don't drift back into that which no longer exists, back into the past. Rest in the reality of this present moment. Rest there unwaveringly as thoughts come and go. In other words, it's not releasing thoughts. It's resting in the stillness of your awareness. And from that stillness, observing the movements of thoughts. And if they pertain to the past, let them slip off into the path without running after them. Thoughts arise about the future, often nowadays of anxiety, trepidation. Don't go into the future, it hasn't come yet. Rest in the immediacy of the present, and whatever thoughts about the future, let them arise. But don't let your awareness merge with them, collapse into them. Memories of the past arise, fine. Don't suppress them, don't release them, let them be, without fusing your awareness with these small fleeting events. And he writes, as for the wild agitation of thoughts of the present moment, so often our thoughts revolve around the present, generally about I, me, mine, I, me, mine. As for them, as soon as you direct your mind inwards upon itself, loosely rest right there, without fixing or modifying anything in the slightest. This is a very subtle approach. There's a lot to be said for training the mind, cultivating virtue, applying antidotes to non-virtuous or pernicious thoughts, selfish thoughts, and so forth. But here's a different strategy. It's very subtle. Simply rest in awareness, that awareness of being aware, the stillness of awareness like space. And whatever thoughts come up, simply be present with them. Whether you find them to be pleasant or unpleasant, virtuous or non-virtuous, let them be and observe them as if from afar. After all, do they really belong to anybody? The sheer fact that I'm witnessing the image of you and your community there doesn't make these images mine. The sheer fact that I'm observing thoughts, images, that in itself doesn't make them mine. And so he says, just let them be without trying to fix them loosely. Rest right there without fixing or modifying anything in the slightest. Loosely rest. There's something very deep here. It's an existential sense of ease, a freedom of anxiety, a sense that it's okay just to be. And here's where I think the deepest refuge comes in. As a Christian, this fundamental refuge. Thy will be done. In Christianity, the fundamental refuge in the primordial purity of one's own pristine awareness, and knowing that through sickness and health, living and dying, this refuge never wavers, it never withdraws. And knowing that, and trusting oneself to that, may give oneself an existential sense of ease, beyond any therapy or any kind of thinking modality. Rest there in ease. This natural settling of thoughts is a way of resting, but is not the main practice. And so in this resting, you're resting in awareness and being attentive to, aware of whatever comes up in the mind, thoughts, emotions, and so on, but without grasping to them, identifying with them, reifying them, grasping onto them as existing in and of themselves, but just letting them be. In so doing, the mind gradually settles in its natural state. And the image that comes to mind is that of a snow globe. We've all seen them. You shake it up and those little particles that look like snow. If you stop agitating it, jerking it around, shaking it, if you just let it be, then all of those little snowflakes gradually settle in the ground. It's quite like that. Just be present, still, non-reactive, discerning, recognizing this from that, not identifying with. And in so doing, the mind settles in its natural state. He said, this is not the main practice, but in that very way of resting, you are ready to encounter pristine awareness, which is the main practice. So in his oral commentary and in the very rich literature behind this, to which I've been exposed, I've been studying and reflecting upon for these past 30 years, when the mind settles in its natural state, your human mind, configured as a man's mind, a woman, a French or a German, an Italian, it settles as if you're falling deep asleep, but lucidly. So I think we all know the term lucid dreaming. You are dreaming, but in the midst of dreaming, you're vividly aware that you are dreaming. Unlike the ordinary dream, you're dreaming and you don't even know you're dreaming And therefore you may experience emotional turmoil, hopes, fears, grief, sorrow, but all because you don't know you're dreaming. As it is possible, and it is a skill that can be cultivated in the Tibetan Buddhist practice of dream yoga, to become lucid and more lucid, more thoroughly comprehend the dream state as the dream state. Similarly, it is possible to slip into deep dreamless sleep, stage 4 non-REM sleep, they call it, and be lucid, to be deep dreamless, and yet be vividly aware, loosely aware that you are dreaming. When you do so, your human mind with your personal history, your ethnicity, your gender, your story has all dissolved for the time being. And you're resting there in a primal flow of awareness that has no history. It's non-conceptual. And yet it can be if you are lucid, discerning, clear, bright, sharp, but is not really human. Not in the Tibetan Buddhist view. It is primal. It underlies, it's a current that underlies the flow or beneath the flow of a human mind, that of a primate, a bird, another mammal, a reptile, a primal flow of consciousness which is not divine. In the Buddhist view, if we wanted to use the word soul, we could say, okay, this is the soul. It's individuated. It's not a collective unconscious. It is called substrate consciousness, or in Sanskrit, alaya vijnana. You tap into that explicitly and knowingly when you fall deep asleep and you're lucid. And you can see for yourself, is there anything distinctively human about this dimension of consciousness? And one of my teachers achieved, after years and years of training, the ability to fall asleep and remain lucid all the way through the night, through multiple cycles of dreaming, going back into dream sleep, and seeing how the configurations of human mind while dreaming emerge from this primal flow, dissolve back into the primal flow. And then you wake up and your human mind is reactivated, but it's emerging not from brain cells or chemistry or for nothing. It's emerging from this primal flow that crystallizes, so to speak, as this dreaming consciousness, this waking consciousness. And so the Buddhist view, which can be tested, is that this dimension of consciousness, which is that which we revert to every time we fall deep asleep, but usually non-lucidly and therefore unconsciously, this continuum, individuated continuum of consciousness, precedes the formation of the body in this lifetime. It carries on after this lifetime. And as the theory can be tested, because the Buddhist view is that memories, all of our memories, of what we had for breakfast this morning, childhood memories, and so forth, all of our memories are not stored in chemicals. It's a categorical error to think that emotions, memories, images, and so forth are stored in chemicals. It actually makes no sense at all. They don't emerge from chemicals. The Buddhist view is that our memories are not stored in the brain any more than your software and hardware are stored in the keyboard. They're stored in this substrate consciousness. Memories are there, and in the Buddhist view, you may indeed, if you go deep into samadhi, sustain this explicit awareness, vivid and bright, resting in the hard drive of the mind, so to speak. You may access memories explicitly and accurately from very early in this lifetime and even prior lifetimes. And it is this that carries on to the future. A testable hypothesis. It's a hypothesis that has been posed by contemplatives of the Hindu, the Buddhist, and the Taoist traditions. And we find also contemplatives in the Jewish, the Kabbalah, early Christianity, Church Father Origen, in the Sufi tradition. We find it in Western philosophy, Pythagoras, who is said to be able to remember 20 past lives, Socrates, who embraced this, Plato embraced this. So there it is, this hypothesis. And for myself, I'm not here to advocate Buddhism versus some other worldview, but before I die, I would like to know what is true. Where did my human mind come from? And what will become of it when I die? So this method, this simple method, is a way to tap into that primal flow. But he states here very explicitly, this is not the main practice, because this is a practice of Dzogchen. And so he says, as soon as you rest in your natural state, this unconfigured state, if we liken a human mind, any mind, we may liken it to a snowflake. And they say that every snowflake is utterly unique. I don't know whether that's true, but I'm utterly convinced that every human being, every animal's mind is utterly unique. But when we settle the mind in its natural state, that crystallized snowflake of an individual mind melts into something primal. And it's there thoughts spontaneously cease and depart, as if you'd fallen asleep, but with radiant clarity. He writes here, in the natural lucidity where thoughts disappear, is the empty, transparent, essential nature of the mind. And the experience arises that is like space, without anything on which to focus and free of falling to any extreme. This empty, essential nature of is the Dharmakaya. So as you very well know, Father Laurence, in Buddhism, as Trinity, as the Trinity figures very prominently in all of Christianity, in all of Mahayana Buddhism, the three bodies of the Buddha, the Dharmakaya, the Buddha mind, Sambhogakaya, a very subtle manifestation or personification of the Buddha's mind, Nirmanakaya, how the divine mind is made flesh, manifests as people, and so forth. This is an experiential way, says the Dzogchen tradition, and not just this one Lama, of ascertaining the Dharmakaya experientially, and not simply as a doctrinal point that one must adhere to or embrace. The theme here is you strip your mind down to its naked primal flow. That is your flow, it's not anybody else's flow. And then from that space of clarity, of stillness, of non-conceptuality, you invert your awareness right into that which is aware. And now we go from the basic practice of shamatha, which is the training of attention, mindfulness, introspection, to vipassana, the cultivation of insight. I think corresponds at least roughly to contemplatio, to contemplation, or theoria, from the Greek, to behold. And this is very similar to the term vipassana, which means to see, but to see exceptionally. One probes into that which is aware with a question. And the question is that which is aware, that which is meditating. Does it exist or not? If it exists, then that which is aware, as one probes right into one's own identity as the one who is aware, if I do exist, then I must have characteristics by which I can be identified. What are those characteristics? Reveal yourself. As we speak to ourselves, what are your characteristics by which I can know you? And we may find that we can't point anything. Do I have a shape, a color? Do I have form? Do I have characteristics by which I can be known as this individual person? And one may find there's nothing coming up. But then if we say, but if I don't exist, then who's doing the meditation? And this is a way for challenging and actually shattering the conceptual constructs of to be and not to be, of existence and non-existence. These are the framework by which we navigate through life. Does it exist or not? Is it there or not? Am I here or not? But the very categories of existence and non-existence are not inherent. They're not objective. They're not discovered. They are conceptual constructs. And this probing inwards is a way to shatter, to break through the confines of this individuated sense of self, even one that flows with this primal flow of consciousness. That if we look for this individuated, self-existent observer, the one who is aware, we find that it can either be deemed as existent. If it were, we could find its characteristics not to be found. But it can't be deemed non-existent because this is a foolishness. After all, there's someone meditating. And so we shatter these two conceptual extremes, break through them, durchbruch, cutting through. The Tibetan is texture, cutting through something rigid and gnarly, and seeing the emptiness, the freedom, the transcendence of all conceptual categories as we probe inwards. And that very emptiness, the unfindability of myself as someone autonomous, self-existent. It's an emptiness, a freedom, a transcendence from all conceptual categories altogether. And that empty essential nature is said to be Dharmakaya, Buddha mind, pristine awareness, primordial consciousness. So this is an experiential avenue to cut through not only the dimension of the human psyche, not only the dimension of the primal stream of consciousness, the Alai-Vijnana, but cutting through so that ascertained experientially our ultimate ground of being, called here the empty essential nature. Emptiness, a kenosis, so to speak, an emptying out of everything personal. My body, my mind, my personality, but even a release of identification with this individuated primal flow, to see that too is not I. To cut through to a dimension of consciousness, which, as I mentioned yesterday, transcends the 3 times. It abides in the 4th time, transcending the 3 times and yet permeating the 3 times. It's non-local. It's not localized inside my body, outside my body, non-local and yet pervading all of space. To view reality from that perspective is the great perfection. But then one can ask, when you're resting in that empty essential nature, empty of all conditioned phenomena, to the unborn, the unceasing, is there anything more than a sheer vacuity, the nihilo? And you look closely and you say, yes, there's something more. Yangjana Rinpoche writes here, right there in that emptiness is the clear and lucid manifest nature of the mind, devoid of any expressible substantial characteristics, its own spacious and unimpeded luminosity, which is naturally clear, is the Sambhogakaya. When you're resting in that emptiness, that culmination of the apophatic, the via negativa, it's not simply a sheer nothingness, but it's permeated by a changeless light. And this he identifies as Sambhogakaya, the subtlest personification or embodiment of the divine mind. And also to personify, in the Dzogchen tradition, primordial consciousness, may we personify it in an authentic way, and we do. It is called Samantabhadra, primordial Buddha. Samantabhadra means the all good, the totally good. Samantabhadra personifying this primordial consciousness, and often, as you quoted Irenaeus yesterday, Irenaeus, of Eros itself having potentially a transcendent dimension to it. We see in Vajrayana Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist iconography, Samantabhadra personifying primordial consciousness, and Samantabhadri, the consort, with no hierarchy between the two, as this ultimate ground, this ultimate emptiness, and in divine union, the union of emptiness and luminosity. So, to come slowly to a close here, Yangjana Rinpoche writes here, there is no other perceiver of this luminous, empty, pristine awareness. That which is perceived is the empty Dharmakaya. That which perceives is luminous, primordial consciousness. These two may be expressed as emptiness and luminosity, and they may be called absolute space or primordial space and primordial consciousness. These two are not separate. The manifest nature of that emptiness is luminosity, and the essential nature of that luminosity is emptiness. So luminosity and emptiness are unitary. They're not separate, for they are one taste. There is no duality of the perceived and the perceiver. This is perceived non-dually, so it is called discerning self-awareness, in which the mind sees itself. That very nature of the one taste of luminosity and emptiness is the equal taste of good and bad, of samsara and nirvana. So there is no difference between the two, samsara and nirvana. Just that is the great perfection. So a tiny bit of commentary and then I'll close. This is finally the answer to the question, who am I? Beyond our more superficial responses, I'm a man, I'm American, I'm Buddhist, going deeper than that, going down to the primal flow, identifying there and cutting through there, cutting through that, to know who I am is to know that you have always been primordially pure. That one could say poetically, you have always been a Buddha, dreaming that you're a human being. So it is a common aphorism in Dzogchen. There's one difference between sentient beings who spin around in the cycle of birth, aging, sickness, and death in this ocean of suffering. The difference between sentient beings, as so defined, and Buddhas, those who are awake, is sentient beings don't know who they are, and Buddhists do. We conclude now with the final, very short paragraphs by Yangchen Rinpoche. In the mind stream of one who realizes this great perfection, impartial compassion and impartial pure vision emerge effortlessly and naturally. This is the all-pervasive compassion, the Nirmanakaya. The Nirmanakaya consists of all the effulgences, displays, the emanations of divine consciousness, manifesting as humans, manifesting in all manner of ways, to lead all sentient beings from suffering and its causes, to lead each one to their own perfect awakening. So while in meditative equipoise, you're simply resting in this non-duality of emptiness and luminosity, Dharmakaya and Sambhogakaya, when you emerge from your meditative equipoise, you're engaging with the world around you. What stems effortlessly, spontaneously from this view of the great perfection is unconditioned, boundless compassion for all those around you. And he concludes in his final paragraph, the pristine awareness of the three kayas, Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, Nirmanakaya, is just that. So recognize that it is nothing other than that. The Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, Nirmanakaya are nothing other than the empty essential nature, the luminous manifest nature, and the spontaneous effulgence of unconditioned compassion to all beings. The three bodies of the Buddha are not something out there. They're not something you achieve. They're not objective. They are the ultimate ground of your own being. And he concludes, as long as there's vague uncertainty, realization of the nature of existence will never come. So you must ascertain this from within. This is the view of the great perfection. So, Father Laurence, I've studied many texts, received many teachings over these last 30 years, but I have found this to be unexcelled in terms of encapsulating the entirety of the view. And then the meditation flows out from that. The meditation is sustaining that way of viewing reality from this perspective. And the way of life or conduct is leading our lives in a way that nurtures, supports, cultivates that view. And the three are inextricably bound together. So that is a brief introduction to the view of the great perfection. So I would really like now to not have a question and answer, because we all have questions and we all have answers. I think there's an egalitarianism here. But any comments from your side, from Eva's side, the people behind you, our Sangha, I would love now just to have an open and free-flowing conversation for some time. So maybe I can turn to you first, Father Laurence.
Well, thank you, Alan. That was a beautiful, powerful, and memorable exposition of the Trinity. Thank you. I think St. Augustine could hardly have done better than your mentor.
I praise.
Well, there were so many resonances in what you said. I'll just throw a few reflections from what you said. And I felt there were moments. Well, first of all, of course, we try to bring the two models of reality together. And I think comparing these three, the Dharmakaya, the Sambhogakaya, and the Nirmanakaya, with the Trinity is inevitable. Mm-hmm. And I've been wondering which is which. So as you showed, I came to the conclusion, but I might change by this evening, that the Sambhogakaya, this manifest nature of the mind, the bliss, the pure light, is the Father. God is light, and there is no darkness in God at all. The pure light non-self-reflective, just pure light. And then the Dharmakaya is, as I understand it from what you said, it's the, well, I think he says there, it's the nature, the law, the order, almost the logos, and is a manifestation of this. So the son of the word is generated simultaneously and eternally from the Father, from this pure light. They are one, but there is a distinction. The distinction is constantly being absorbed in the other. Come back to that. And then I thought the Nirmanakaya, which is, I'd read this before but it struck me from what you said. This is pure compassion. This is love, the emanation of love in time and space, as well as in eternity. And so this is the Holy Spirit, the love that flows between the Father and the Son, and in whom the Father and the Son have their unity. It's the unity of them, but it's the unity of timeless compassion. So anyway, I think it's always dangerous to try to put two models on top of each other, but they seem, from a certain distance anyway, they seem to me to harmonize or be congruent in a very exciting way. And maybe this model of the Trinity, of the triadic structure of reality, is the way for interfaith, inter-contemplative dialogue to proceed in this century. That's the biggest challenge we face in religion, is this kind of dialogue. And St. Augustine says, of course, that we find, and I think this would relate to what you were saying, that we find this Trinity in ourselves. Mm-hmm. That the human being is the microcosm or the reflection, but it's a perfect hologram or something. It's a reflecting this ultimate reality. So we find it in the nature of our own consciousness and the way our mind works, the way we work as human beings. This is a manifestation of the ultimate reality that we call God. That is this dance, the dance of the persons of the Trinity as they merge into each other. And if that's the case, then everything in this life, everything in our experience, or not only sentient beings, but everything in our total experience, is a reflection of that realization, of our realizing that there is only God, that there is one God and there is no other. Now, that's a great statement that means something when we have reached the end of the process of realization. But in the process of coming to it, which is how you began, as the text begins by talking about how we meditate, then we see that there is a struggle here. There is a work to be done. We are pilgrims on the way. We are not yet fully realized. We could say we are not God, but we are becoming God. That's at the heart of the Christian doctrine, dogma. God became human so that human beings might become God. So then I was picking up from what you were saying about the process of meditation and that stilling the mind, resting the thoughts, is not the main practice. And that's very important in an age where we have put mindfulness as if it's the supreme spirituality, but just calming the mind is not the primary purpose, but it's a way to encounter that pristine awareness. So I would have a few questions and areas for discussion that will grow out of that, but that will come later or on another occasion. But it does seem to me, you began by talking about changing one's view, or seeing the view, and that is metanoia, that is changing one's mind, changing the orientation of one's mind. And in fact, in the Christian understanding, contemplation is the work of love, precisely because it is about the work of changing the direction of one's attention. And that is love, to turn our attention wholly, completely towards the other, another. I think you said at one point the other doesn't exist. But in another sense, of course, only the other exists. This is something Simone Weil comes back to very often, that we assume that we have a reality that is comparable over against the reality of God. But in fact, the only reality is God. And we only have reality by turning away from ourselves and finding ourselves in God. But that's the paradox, which I thought which is also the death and the emptiness that you were referring to as the way in which we go to this. You mentioned your teacher who wrote this had his 18 years in a Chinese labor camp, concentration camp. And I met your Tibetan teacher, and I met a Chinese Catholic bishop who had been in a concentration camp for about the same amount of time. And I don't think he was the greatest administrator, but he was a radiant, enlightened, and beautiful being who just shed light and love and forgiveness around him. And it's almost as if we have to go through suffering in order to enter into a permanent state of this pristine awareness, or of this view, the contemplation, the teoria. We have to go through suffering. There is no way. And the cross is one manifestation of that. And the Bodhi tree under which the Buddha suffered on the night of his enlightenment, when he was tempted in all directions, is another expression of that. And as we go through this time of suffering, this is really valuable teaching and valuable insight, because it gives meaning and hope. Suffering is suffering. You don't know when it's going to end, and while you're going through it, everything is evacuated of meaning and consolation. Nevertheless, there is this substratum of meaning and hope. So anyway, those were just a few reflections. There are many others. I was taking notes as you wrote. Finally, the last thing I would say is that going through that suffering, going through that paradox, that portal of paradox, which arises, which becomes illuminated by the question, who am I? And you answered that in what you said very, very beautifully. I think in the Christian at Easter on Holy Saturday, which is the day when nothing happens between Good Friday and Easter Sunday, there's a beautiful reading in the church's liturgy from a 2nd century author, is all we know, and it's Christ speaking to us. And there is this amazing line where Christ says to the reader, to us, "You and I form one undivided person." You and I form one undivided person. And I think I thought of that for many of the things you were saying about how we enter into this view. We're not looking at it. We're not looking at it as if it were an object or reified, as you said. But it also, but so how do we see without seeing it as an object? Well, there was a young boy in a meditation class, in a meditation group we had for children once, very brilliant guy, actually. He's now professor of international politics somewhere. And he said, I asked him this question: what happens when an irresistible force meets an immovable object.
Right.
It was a question in an Oxford philosophy paper.
Sure.
And Georgian, he thought about it deeply, and then he said, the energy of one gets transformed into the energy of the other. And it echoes that line, also the verse that you probably know in the first letter of John, what we shall be like, we do not know. But we know we shall be like him because we shall see him as he is. And so there's this sense that we become what we see, but also what we see is already us. And so this may be the non-duality that we talk about. But those are a few random reflections on what you beautifully presented. I'm very, very touched and moved by it. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurence. I'd like to respond very briefly, indeed, very briefly, and then turn it over. I'd love to hear Eva's thoughts. But as you were speaking, just 2 points, and that is this distinction between eudaimonia and hedonia. And the eudaimonia being at the root of the wisdom traditions of Socrates, of Augustine, of Buddhism, Shankara, and so forth. And in this Dzogchen view, it's very clear that the ultimate source, the wellspring of all eudaimonia for all sentient beings, is none other than this. It is knowing who you are, viewing reality from this perspective. It is the great perfection. It is pristine awareness. And so while all sentient beings are looking for happiness and sustainable happiness, not just now and then, we are all seeking in our pursuit of happiness, our wish for happiness. We will never be satisfied. In the Buddhist view, from lifetime to lifetime, we'll never be satisfied. We'll never be at rest until we look in the right direction and we tap into and know the ultimate source, the timeless source of the well-being we've always sought. 1 point. Second point, very brief, coming directly from your comments, and that is in the Dzogchen view, when you are viewing reality from that perspective, even as you're out in the world, engaging with the world, you see from that perspective, from this view of the great perfection, all appearances, without exception, all appearances as Nirmanakaya, all sounds as Sambhogakaya, the Logos, and all thoughts, all activity of the mind as expressions of Dharmakaya, effulgence, creative expressions of Dharmakaya. So truly, this is a Buddhist vision of theophany, where all that you're seeing is an expression of the divine, and yet you're not on another planet. You've not shifted to some alternate universe. The people around you will be seeing an ocean of suffering with great hope that this will turn out well and hope that doesn't turn out badly. But the fundamental perspective is radically different. You've tapped into reality. You've awakened to the dream. Eva, I'm sure you have many thoughts to contribute.
Mind if I come a little this way so I'm not in the sun anymore?
Oh, that's much better. Is that better?
Yeah, I think so. So thank you both. I agree with you thoroughly, Father Laurence, that the parallel of the Trikaya, the three kayas, to the Trinity is unmistakable, but I still haven't decided which is which either. And I think, sorry?
I'm glad to hear that. Good. No, good.
And to me, it's part of the marvel of the mystery of the parallelism but incommensurability of revelation in a Christian context and what I would call revelation in a Buddhist context. And so I had not actually spent time thinking of the Father as Sambhogakaya because I had for so long associated the Father with Dharmakaya as the ground of being, the source, the ungenerated, unbegotten, ultimate reality, because Dharmakaya is so closely associated in Buddhism with emptiness itself, but also with omniscient knowledge. There's the Jnana Dharmakaya, which is the Dharmakaya of primordial consciousness, and there are many facets to that which encompass all the types of divine knowledge, and indeed could be very comparable to, for example, St. Thomas's treatises on divine knowledge. But part of the paradox for me, so I'll throw out a few more problems with equating any one with one, because of course, if we see, as so often, the language of Christ as the wisdom of God, the power of God, as in St. Paul, Vijnana Dharmakaya would be the wisdom of God. So are we already, is there a bifurcation of Father and Son within the Dharmakaya? One could also, there's a definite association of the Sambhogakaya with the word, the foundation of all mantra, as Alan just said, a pure vision of all sounds as the expression of Sambhogakaya. So there's a kind of natural association of this extremely subtle light, but also avenue of teaching, not in this particular text, but throughout Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism. The Sambhogakaya is associated with the most rarefied enlightened teaching that then has to be translated down to the level of human beings. But very high bodhisattvas can hear the direct word of the Buddhas through the Sambhogakaya form. So for a long time, I've associated, Logos, the word, the Sambhogakaya. But then do we ask, is the incarnate Christ Sambhogakaya? It would seem so natural that this is Nirmanakaya, the very word, the Sanskrit word Nirmanakaya means the one who is sent, the sent. And so it seems, as I say, natural, inevitable to associate incarnation with Nirmanakaya. And yet there's a plurality to Nirmanakaya in all Mahayana teaching, the countless Nirmanakaya, and not only as human teachers, but as they say, a bridge or a tree or the sound of the ocean could be a Nirmanakaya teaching one. So again, not a direct parallel, not commensurate with the idea of the singularity of incarnation in Christianity. And then furthermore, one could see the Holy Spirit in terms of Sambhogakaya, because it's this rarefied, subtle, I'm even thinking of the 21 qualities of wisdom in the Book of Wisdom, these subtle, penetrating characteristics of wisdom that is always present, but very difficult to see until we plunge deeply into the contemplative life. So I'm deliberately kind of problematizing, throwing back and forth across levels, how there is something of each in each. And for me, I'm totally at peace with that. But one way in which I can find it meaningful for practice, I guess, and no longer a theorizing, but okay, what does this mean as an experience? Not an idea of God, not a theologizing about God, but an experience of God, as this very text is so directly pointing to, not even thinking about Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, Nirmanakaya as something out there, but something that's immediately present in the nature of consciousness as it can be experienced. I like to look at it as, what is the contemplative experience of Christ himself, embodying all three persons of the Trinity as one within himself, which of course is such a theme in the mystical tradition, to see, as Julian of Norwich says, where I see Christ, I see the Father, I see the Son, I see the Holy Spirit. And so the intimacy with which Christ sees the depths of his own awareness, his own consciousness, as the Father, who is more intimate to him than any other reality. To know the word, and I'm deliberately paralleling Augustine's reflection here, to know the word within his own mind as his very identity that creates. To know the Spirit, as St. Paul says, we have the mind of Christ, and he's just been speaking about the Spirit. So the mind of Christ as Spirit goes so far back in the Christian tradition. So how can you separate the Holy Spirit from Christ if it is his very mind? It is his very breath. It is his very Spirit. And so, of course, I'm just throwing these things out as things that has been meaningful to me. But I'll dare to take another step, which is that this very contemplation could lead us to think in a new way about the uniqueness of Christ. Because when I reflect on the great Buddhist realized masters of the past, whether it be Yangtang Rinpoche or Dudjom Ningpa or Lama Tsongkhapa or countless others, but Guru Padmasambhava himself, through the Indian and Tibetan tradition, who are not Shakyamuni Buddha, or are not the Buddha who sat under the Bodhi tree, but whom the tradition acknowledges have, many of whom, not all of them, but many of whom the tradition acknowledges have reached realization equal to that of the Buddha. If the very contemplative path is calling us to look at this unity within ourselves, as you just quoted so beautifully, you and I form one undivided person. We become what we see, and what we see is already us. This union so deep. The only thing stopping us from it now is a lack of realization. It is this avidya, this ignorance that in which we fail to see who we are. But if realization itself, stable, penetrating, all-encompassing realization, not just a partial experience here or there, but something that permeates every moment of our conscious awareness, then apart from metaphysical categories, which have their place for sure, it begs the question for me, it constantly begs the question for me, how do we hold the uniqueness of Christ in his existential metaphysical reality as embodying all three persons of the Trinity, indivisible from his humanity, from the realization, and I'll take it out of the Christian tradition, of a Buddhist master who sees the pristine awareness at the depths of their being and is no longer identifying with a surface level human consciousness. The purification of all past sin becomes so complete that that is washed away, set aside entirely. What do we mean by total purification and total expansion of good qualities, as the Tibetan word sangye means? Sangye doesn't actually mean awakened. It means totally purified and totally rich, effulgent in all the good qualities. So this will be an unfinished statement because I just leave it as this question. And I would love to hear your thoughts on this, Father Laurence.
Well, when we were preparing for this dialogue a few weeks ago, we looked at this great text from the Philokalia, Diadicus, on spiritual knowledge. And he has this little paragraph where he says, why talk about any of this stuff at all, more or less? Or what he says is, if you can only speak about it if you are in it. And if you're not in it, you're outside of it, looking at it, and therefore, what you say is not so valuable. So that's in a way where we are at the level of words and exchange of ideas. Well, we could carry this on for at least another 6 hours, I think, if we could keep away from tea and biscuits until then. But it was nothing. It's nothing to what we will know when we fall off the cliff edge, and the moment of passing beyond this realm of existence, then a completely different kind of knowledge. But I suppose in this life, we are moving towards that. As you asked, what was the nature of Jesus's contemplation? That's the big question, and the Christological question, the study of the person of Jesus, in whom the Christian sees a unique, although that word unique is a very dangerous word because everything is unique, but a unique parallel coexisting or union of the divine and the human. So the final and the process and the end of the process, or the origin and what the origin produces. Anyway, so God and man. And I think we see that amazingly in the Gospel of John most clearly, because the Gospel of John, the last Gospel written after the deepest theological, mystical reflection upon the person of Jesus, is the highest Christology. You see Jesus right from the very beginning as the Word of God, and yet it's this Gospel that gives us some of the most moving and human, ordinary examples of his humanity. Jesus weeping at the loss of a friend. Jesus thirsty and tired and hungry and so on, and angry. I mean, very human. And at the same time, out of this gospel comes the Father and I are one. May they all be one as I am in them and they are in me, and so on. And we also see this amazing moment at the culmination of his life where he undergoes a conflict between himself and the Father. Mm-hmm. Because like any human being, he says, why? Well, maybe he doesn't say, why me? But he says, not me. I don't want to die. I don't want to have to go through this ordeal. Let this cup pass from me. And then, as Alan said, he then says, but not as I will, but your will be done. Well, here's in a few words, here's a mighty conflict between the ego or the I identity and the Father. And yet they are resolved. This is the paradox here is that they are not irreconcilable. The irresistible force and the immovable object merge. And so I think I was thinking of a koan. I wrote down a little koan to give for us to reflect on, maybe the people listening as well, who are many of them are sending in messages and will have many questions, and we're listening to you as well. Because the culmination of this beautiful vision or view is of this wonderful unity, union, or simplicity, this infinite simplicity. And yet, even if we are tasting that to some limited degree now, we live in we are also aware of the beauty of the particular. And this is a big question often in Buddhist Christian discussions, how can you just wipe out the value of the individual or the individual identity, and is there whatever. So my koan is this, which I've been thinking of while walking around these grounds recently, and the spring is coming, smells, and so why does a rose, well, we don't have roses yet, but why does a rose smell like a rose? And why does freshly cut grass smell like freshly cut grass? No, maybe not a very good koan, but anyway, I didn't have time to prepare. So, why doesn't the rose smell like freshly cut grass? And will it ever smell like freshly cut grass? Yeah. Alan will have an answer to that.
Laurence, I'd like to jump in again. Again, catalyzed by a comment you made. I didn't actually say there was no other. I didn't actually say that. But this is something very interesting. On this relative level, where you are over there in France, Eva and I are here in Colorado and so forth, you are not I am not you, and I delight in that. I don't want to just talk to myself, But in this relationship, from this relative level, You're always rising relative to me as I'm rising relative to you. I'm rising relative to me, and that's not an absolute perspective. So we are not the same, but we have this richness of difference that we can celebrate as long as we don't reify. And my fist always does this. My hand goes into this mudra of reification as you're radically over there, I'm radically over here. But relatively speaking, you are arising relative to everyone in the room, relative to everyone listening. And all of these mandalas, with each of us in the center of a mandala, all arising in mutual interdependence. Good for the relative perspective. But this notion that there is no other from the perspective, now great perfection perspective, from that perspective, viewing reality from pristine awareness, all appearances of every kind are said to be rang nang, appearances of yourself. But now is this solipsism, and everything hinges on, well, what's the referent of yourself? Is it Alan Wallace? Is it Alan Wallace's substrate consciousness that carries from lifetime to lifetime? No, absolutely not. We just slip into solipsism, and it's ridiculous. All appearances are my own appearances from this perspective, that I am the indivisibility of Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, Nirmanakaya. All are effulgences of Dharmakaya. And that is the ultimate ground of my being. One point. Second point, I think really it's crucial for interface between these two magnificent traditions. Something that, when I came to Buddhism, I just found myself coming home. It wasn't a conversion. There was no point as, oh, now I've converted. I never actually forsook the belief in which I was raised that Jesus was exactly who he said he was. I've never parted from that. There was never a point, oh, I don't believe that anymore. But when I came into Buddhism, I just found myself at home, and in Dzogchen, then this is the nucleus of my home. This is the inner chamber of my home. But for all of Mahayana Buddhism, it is stated when you come back to Nirmanakaya, that the Dharmakaya by way of Sambhogakaya manifests where we can see, we can interact, we can touch, we can listen to countless emanations of the divine, manifesting as Buddha Shakyamuni. But now something that I felt at home when I first heard it is the Dharmakaya does not always manifest as Buddhist teachers. Mm. Buddhism is not, and this is just straight Mahayana Buddhism as advocated everywhere by the Dalai Lama, for example, because he knows Buddhism very, very well, that the Nirmanakaya, the Dharmakaya does not manifest as teachers only as Buddhist teachers. Buddhism is not the best path for everyone. It's the best path for me, that's where I'm at home. But the Dharmakaya may manifest as Christian teachers. The Dharmakaya may manifest as Jesus Christ, may manifest as a great Sufi saint, but not necessarily even manifesting always as religious figures. The Dharmakaya manifests as Nirmanakaya, as human, as non-human, as animate and inanimate, in any way needed to lead each sentient being individually on their own path to their own perfect awakening. And that's a core belief in Mahayana Buddhism. And this is why when the Dalai Lama first came to the West, to only Europe in 1973, the Americans wouldn't give him a visa. He said, I'm coming to the West to listen to the wise people of the West. But he said, I'm not here to advocate Buddhism, to convert. I do not encourage Westerners to convert. He said this many times. I don't encourage you to convert to Buddhism. What I do encourage you to do is go deeper in your own tradition. If you're Christian, be a deeper Christian. If you're Muslim, be a deeper Muslim. If you really have to, like this guy, Alan Wallace, if you really have to, well, then okay, I'm not going to stop you. But that notion that Christianity is the great perfection for devout Christians. And Islam is the great perfection for devout, compassionate Muslims. I found that, okay, I'm at home. But I would love either you or Eva to respond to the issue that I must say it nagged at me. I am the way and the truth and the life. There is no way to the Father but to the Son. The way I heard that when I was a kid, there's only one true faith and everybody's not following that. Too bad for them, And I couldn't go along with that any more than Thomas Huxley and the scientific materialist. There's only one way to truth, and that's science, the only way. He just took this kind of dogmatism, brought it into science, and of course you come up with materialism. I can't accept that either, but nor do I believe that Buddhism is the only way. Otherwise, the Dalai Lama would say, hey, everybody, if you're not Buddhist, you're just following the wrong way. I'm going to help you out. Buddhism is the right. So I'd love to hear your response. Either whether you or or Eva, because I'm sure you have many thoughts arising.
Eva?
For me, this very perspective, the Buddhist understanding that the infinite Dharmakaya can manifest in countless Nirmanakaya, was a doorway to being able to reconcile within myself a dual path, but I can't even call it a dual path anymore because it's so deeply integrated that it would be untrue to myself to say as though I was two different religions at the same time going along together, because that's not an integrated contemplative. And so it has been essential for me to be able to see things from both perspectives alternatively and more at once. So of course we have the understanding, which has I think been so beautifully developed, especially since Vatican II, that the manifestations, the teachings of the Logos are not limited to the incarnation of Jesus Christ and Christianity as we know it, but to acknowledge the presence of the Word of God in other traditions. Where there is truth, there is the Word, there we recognize the teaching of the Logos. And so the way that Alan just spoke it, which is so classically Mahayana Buddhism, to say the emanations, the expressions of the Dharmakaya in the form of Nirmanakaya may appear as non-Buddhist teachers, it has a very similar feel to it, which is we are explaining the world according to our system, as it were, our words, our tradition. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. We have to use words. We have to use words in order to transmit truth as the pathway to realization. So from a Buddhist perspective, to say, well, the Buddha may manifest as Nirmanakaya in other traditions that don't call themselves Buddha. Okay. And then Christianity saying, oh, the Logos, the Word of God, may manifest in truth in other religions that doesn't look like Christianity, but we'll acknowledge that as being true. I would love to see the next step where we don't even have to make the bifurcation anymore, as though there's still a ground home, and then, okay, we'll give the other side the benefit of the doubt and say, well, probably that's also a legitimate manifestation of the central truth that's described here. I do trust, I have deep trust, and it may be in decades or centuries or millennia, that we won't even be using this language in the same way anymore. That an integration and not a co-opting or a colonizing either direction. But I do see a special resonance between Christianity and Buddhism. And that I think there could be a way of phrasing the language even a few decades from now, that we won't even run into that problem anymore. That's what I'm trying to say. Insofar as it appears to be a problem, I don't think it needs to be. The fundamental teachings on emptiness, on this experiential practice of contemplation, whereby we identify the ground of being at the root of our own awareness, not separate from our awareness, but not the way we thought of our awareness as long as the conceptual mind held sway. This experiential identification, what Nyangtang Rinpoche refers to as Dharmakaya, what the Dzogchen tradition can associate with Dharmakaya, but they're already using a concept that had been developed in Mahayana Buddhism with not exactly the same meditation techniques as the Dzogchen tradition passes on. So there's evolution even within Buddhism. And so could the time come when we just start using other words? Well, we've defined it so well, and the experience is repeated among so many practitioners that we don't feel like we're having to cross a bridge anymore. But we know and acknowledge the depth of Christ's revelation death and resurrection. I mean, I would love to speak more about resurrection in the course of our dialogue, probably not today, but what is the universe transcending reality of resurrection that is revealed in Christ? And does that have parallels in the rainbow body of the Great Perfection tradition, or of the union of Dharmakaya and illusory body, or the mind of clear light and illusory body in the Vajrayana tradition? What do these revelations challenge us as practitioners to aspire to, and not worry so much about how things look from one side or the other side, but just get down to practice and just get down to the cushion to be this metanoia, to be this transformation? So I guess that's my comment.
Once before we go to meditation, if I may, I'd love to ask you a question. This very powerful statement that cannot be skirted. I am the way, the truth, and life. There is no way to the Father but through the Son. What's the referent when Jesus says I? What's the referent when he says I am? What's the referent?
Well, it's funny you should ask that question, because I just wrote it down as we were. I was listening. I think, Raymond Panica, the great student of interfaith, inter-religious dialogue, used to say, was once introduced, so he's half Spanish and half Indian. He said, no, I'm not, I'm 100% Indian and 100% Spanish. And I actually saw that once in practice, because I picked him up at the airport when he gave us the John Wynne seminar, and he was dressed as a Spanish, quite dapper looking Spanish professor. And when I went to pick him up to go on stage, he was dressed as an Indian guru. So I think there's a gate that we have to be playful about this and not try to fix it, obviously. And I was also thinking of Jean Leclerc, the great Benedictine scholar of St. Bernard and of the medieval tradition. And he used to help us a lot in our early days. And I was talking with him about interreligious dialogue once, and he said, well, he said, to be quite honest, he said, I think it's great. We must do more of this dialogue, and it's obviously going to develop, as Eva was saying, it will develop and evolve, and very important that we do it. But he said, I've just got enough in the Christian tradition to keep me busy.
Yeah.
So he said, I haven't got time. I haven't got, drawn out of it. So I think that's part of it. But Clement of Alexandria, right in the 2nd century, made the same point that the Vatican Council eventually made, correcting many centuries of distortion, that the truth is the truth. The Logos is the eternal Logos, the pre-existent Logos, precedes the incarnation. And wherever we find the truth, and Clement specifically refers to the Buddha as a source of wisdom and truth. So this goes back a long way. We're breaking new ground, but in a way, the seed was planted a long time ago. So I am the truth, the way, the truth, and the life. Well, here, I don't think, well, we don't know, but I don't imagine that Jesus said this after he had supper one evening and suddenly turned to his friends. And by the way, do you know I am the truth, the way, the truth, and the life? So I think this is the Logos welling up from within the mystery of the scriptures and the mystery of the Spirit of Christ who reveals the unique person of Jesus to us. We only know the risen Christ through the Spirit. So I think this is the Spirit surging up, and the Logos is speaking to us here. And see, what else does he say about the truth? He says, he reveals the truth, and the truth will set you free. So, free from what? Free from sectarianism, from dualism, or from fundamentalism, and from darkness and ignorance and conflict. So this is the Christ of St. Paul in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek. Well, I think we should say, in Christ there is neither Christian nor Buddhist.
Mhm.
Why not? It's the same thing. So, but that's speaking at one level. It doesn't deny the fact that you can be Spanish one day and Indian the next, and that we are, and as Alan was saying, I think it comes down to where your personal center of gravity is. And there's no negotiation or argument about that. If that's where you feel at home, if you're married and this is the person you want to be with, you can't argue with that. That's the way it is. I mean, I once, finally, I once had a moment of temptation to become a Buddhist.
Ah.
And I was visiting a Thai monastery in Thailand, and my friend there, American monk, a Buddhist monk, got delayed. So I was there for a couple of days on my own, and I was very impressed. I couldn't speak to anyone because nobody spoke English, but I was very impressed and moved by the quality of the monastic life there and the seriousness of the meditation. And it was a forest monastery, not one of the others. And for a moment I thought I could be very happy here.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so many of our Western monasteries are too busy and too, you know, running schools or whatever, too busy and not clear about meditation anymore. So for a moment I had that, and then it was a little disturbing actually. But then it was as if the center of gravity just clicked back in, and I said, well, this is who I am and where I am, and I'm happy actually to be here. But I was very grateful for that little temptation. I don't know if it was a temptation, but that sort of attraction. And I think it deepened my, you know, my love of this kind of conversation and the importance of this dialogue. Just before we hand over to Alan to lead us into the meditation, I should just say to everybody present, usually when we've got this meter on the screen telling us there are a lot of questions coming up. We've had lots of answers to this question about the koan, but unfortunately we couldn't read the full answer. It said, a rose smells like a rose because, and we couldn't read anything more. But the other thing that's unusual is that the numbers of people listening have increased while we've been on. Usually people disappear, but it's been increasing. Anyway, it's been wonderful for me, and I hope for you and for all of us here. It's been a wonderful, wonderful dialogue, and we'll be looking at the comments and questions that people are contributing, and we will get to them and integrate them. Okay, so Alan, thank you.
Just a footnote to that. I think our understanding is, among the three of us, is today I would be kind of the prominent voice launching themes, and then in 2 days Eva will do that, and then Saturday we will then be responding to the many questions that have come in. So that'll be the time when we gather together. But for now, I'd like to then turn to silence. The only one that will not be silent will be me, as I guide you in a meditation and asking you to do the impossible, to attend to the guidance, which means to listen to the voice, which I hope will be helpful. At the same time, try to go beyond the voice. In Buddhism, we speak of the word, and when we speak of the meaning of the word, it's not more words. The meaning of the word is the referent. What is the word pointing to? So I will offer guidance for this meditation. It will be 20 minutes, give me just a couple of minutes at the end to bring this all to a closure. And so I invite you all then to sit comfortably. A chime has just sounded, signifying the beginning of the session. And I invite you at the very beginning to relax, to loosen any tension in the shoulders, in the face. Let your awareness descend right down to the ground, where you feel the earth supporting your body. And for just a while, release thoughts, images. Let your mind dissolve into the simplicity, being aware of the sensations arising throughout the entire field of your body. Feel what it's like to be embodied without thinking about it or imagining it. Settle your body in a posture that is relaxed, at ease, comfortable. Still, with no unnecessary movement or fidgeting. And vigilant with your spine straight. Attention. And now something often overlooked. That is our respiration, the nourishment the body receives from breath to breath. It can become very constricted, strained, repressed as we get caught up in our emotions, our thoughts, or rumination. But I invite you now to allow the body to breathe without intervention, without regulation. Breathe now as well as you can, as if you were deep asleep. Releasing the breath with every exhalation all the way to the end. With a quiet mind, allowing the next breath to flow in effortlessly, without pulling it in, without impeding it. Let the breath flow in as effortlessly as a wave washes up on shore. And with every out-breath, relax more and more deeply in the body. Release the breath all the way to the end. And with every exhalation, release. Let go of any thoughts, memories, images that may come to mind. Like a flock of birds released from a pen, from a cage, flying off into the sky. Just release your thoughts into the space of awareness with every exhalation. And thereby, with every out-breath, return to silence. And then as we settle the body at ease, still and vigilant, I invite you now to let your awareness rest in this existential sense of ease, beyond the domain of hope and fear, desire and aversion. Fearlessly releasing, just for this short while, all thoughts pertaining to the past and the future. Releasing as in, just let them be without identifying with them and being carried away by them. Rest utterly at ease in the stillness of your awareness. In this simple, unmediated awareness of being aware, this self-knowing quality, consciousness. Let your awareness remain, rest at ease, in stillness. And the very nature of awareness is that it illuminates, it makes manifest all manner of appearances and experiences. Were there no consciousness, there would be no appearances, there would be no experience. It is awareness that is all illuminating. Rest in that natural luminosity, that clarity of your own awareness. Relaxed, self-knowing, self-illuminating, and rest there for a moment. Then as we turn to the next phase of the meditation, let your eyes be at least partially open. Your gaze vacant, resting in the space in front of you without looking at or focusing on anything. Bring your awareness out into space to overcome any mistaken notion that your awareness, your mind is somehow encapsulated inside your head. That is a mere function of the brain, which is quite a tragic superstition. And now, as young Tanabhaji said, direct your attention not outwards, direct it inwards. Upon the awareness that is present. Inwards upon this domain of the mind wherein all thoughts, mental images, memories and fantasies, desires and emotions come and go. Observe rather than identifying with the movements of the mind without releasing them, without trying to have them go away. Rest in the stillness of your awareness, in the midst of the movements of the mind. This awareness is discerning, clear. It recognizes thoughts, images, and so on. Observes them without identifying with them and being carried away by them. Again, rest in the stillness, the cognizance, the clarity of your own awareness. Illuminating and knowing all the movements, the comings and goings of the mind, and letting them be without seeking to modify any of them, to perpetuate them or terminate them. Let them be. Observe closely, but with a sense of ease, continuing to allow the breathing to flow unimpededly and effortlessly. Simultaneously be aware of the stillness of your awareness and the movements of the mind. If over time one cultivates and develops this quality, this inner stillness in a sustainable way, then like that snow globe in which all the little flakes of snow come to settle on the ground, you will find thoughts subside, the mind calms. And if you go deeper and deeper into this samadhi, this radical unification of awareness, you may find that the awareness withdraws from the 5 sensory fields. And you're aware only of the space of the mind and the events arising within it. You've drawn into the inner chamber of your awareness, your own mind. As if you'd fallen asleep, but instead of losing the clarity of awareness as you fall asleep on this path of samadhi, the clarity, the incandescence of awareness increases as you draw into that stillness. Until finally the space of the mind becomes empty. And there is just the light of your awareness within an empty field. And your mind is settled in its natural state. Permeated by a sense of well-being, stillness, of clarity. And then we turn to the next phase of the practice. Contemplation, inquiry, probing into the very nature of that which is aware. Draw your awareness even more inward. Into that which is aware. And when you do so, observe closely what comes to mind when you seek to observe the observer. And ask of that which is aware, do you have characteristics? How may you be known? Do you have shape or color? Do you have size? Can you observe any characteristics of that which is observing, that which is aware? By which you can objectify yourself as someone in here. If I exist, someone in here, the observer, then I must have characteristics by which I can be known. But what are those characteristics? Where did I come from? I wasn't always here. And where am I now? And I won't always be here. Where will I go? This one who is observing. Do I not exist at all? Do I have no origin, location, or destination? Do I have no characteristics? Do I not exist at all? But then, of course, who's asking that question? And if I draw that conclusion, who just drew that conclusion? I cannot be non-existent. And yet, how can I be deemed existent if I can't identify characteristics of that which is observing? And in probing deeply, we may transcend, we may shatter the very conceptual categories of existence and non-existence. And know non-dually, not as an object, the emptiness of awareness, of a singular, real awareness in here. An emptiness of all conceptual categories, an emptiness of all conditioned attributes. Rest in that emptiness. That nihilo. But as you rest there, is that all you experience? Only an emptiness? Only an absence? Do you not detect a clarity, a luminosity, a brightness, a wakefulness? The sense of incandescent presence. This is the manifest nature of your awareness. As the emptiness is Dhammakaya, this is Sambhogakaya. The luminosity of awareness illuminates and knows the emptiness of awareness. But there is no division between the knower and the known. The emptiness is luminous. The luminosity is empty. The knower is the known. Unborn, unceasing. Rest there. And now let us gently emerge from this temporary withdrawal from the phenomenal world around us, from our own bodies and minds. Let us emerge. Come out of retreat. And let our awareness illuminate the appearances of our body and mind, of the environment, of our fellow creatures, without moving from this primordial stillness, this unborn, unceasing luminosity. And see all appearances as effulgences displays of your own pristine awareness, all sounds as the words of Dharma, expressions of the divine, all thoughts, images, effulgences of primordial consciousness. And observe how compassion arises unimpededly and effortlessly in all directions. May we all be free of suffering and find the ultimate happiness that we seek. With this sound of the chime, we bring this session to a close. But our practice continues. So Laurence, I'd like to thank you for this time that we've been able to share together across the seas, the many oceans, uniting as one in spirit. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Eva. And thank you all around the world who have been joining us. And again, we offer this peace that we have shared, the insight into reality, even in this time of suffering and chaos, and anxiety. We can find this peace in ourselves, not as the world gives it, but as the Spirit gives it. So thank you, Alan, for leading us to see that in many ways, in words and in silence and in ourselves. And let's take this peace and share it with others. And we meet again every time we meditate, but we will meet again on Thursday at the same time, and Eva will be guiding us in that session. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.